Hello and welcome to this edition of the Beacon Hill Report. My name is Jim Marshall, and joining us today in studio is State Representative Tony Cabral. Representative, you're the first one to do it twice now for the year, so I appreciate it. See,
that's great. You know, the way it works. So
we went in alphabetical order, and Rep. Cabral is the first to get a double dose. So as we tape this program, it's late summer now here. So the last time you were in, obviously, we had just started the budget process. That is moving on. But there's still a lot of things that that are coming up and have to deal with. I know that the legislature comes back from their summer recess soon. I don't think there's any formal session yet. But
not yet, but it will be soon, very
soon. So just generically, for people who don't know, what transpires now? The budget, the fiscal year is done, it's starting again. What transpires between late summer and the end of the year, calendar year?
Well, there are a number of priorities on the agenda, both personal priorities and, of course, priorities of the legislature as a whole. And some of those, this is the time to not only formulate those, but actually begin the serious discussions and the serious conversations and discussions before we actually have a full debate on some of those ideas or some of those priorities. It's a full agenda, right?
Is it more priority? Is it more legislative than, say, when the budget process is done, things get approved financially, and say, okay, we earmarked this amount for this project, or what have you? Is it more now? Again, this is for people who may not understand. It's more legislative now. There's more laws or what have you that are done during this period of time?
Well, I mean, there are a combination. You still have budget issues going on. We need to close out the fiscal year that just ended in June 30th. Usually we do sometime in the early fall, middle fall, we do a supplemental budget to close out the rest of the fiscal year. That's where the rest of the bills get paid, so to speak. And also those are opportunities also to make some changes or affect some other budget impacts for either earmarks or other issues that haven't been completely resolved.
I think it's
that's an issue. I think
it's a busy time for you too, because a lot of the stuff that you deal with, the bonding issues, I think come up this time of year too.
Yes, and we do have a lot of bond issues to deal with. The committee that I chair, the governor filed, for example, a huge transportation bond bill. It's going to be heard first by a joint committee, then it comes to my committee. A bill in $17 billion transportation bond bill, right? Part of that, usually bond bills run on 5-year periods. Part of this bill that the governor filed will be a 10-year. Will be 10-year bonds in some 10-year bond bill, meaning it will take 10 years to really use all those authorizations. In some will be 5, so it will be sort of a mix of 5-year authorizations and 10-year authorizations. That's why the number is so big, because we're doing in some areas a 10-year authorization in some areas. So you got that. We have the IT bond bill now that is in my committee. We have not had a public hearing yet. We're going to schedule a public hearing shortly, within the next several weeks. And that's for needs that the state have around information technology. And you probably have witnessed some of those issues. For example, the latest RMV issue with licenses. Some of it is connected to the software that was introduced and implemented back in 2018, which the state spent around $135 million to develop and implement that new software to make the RMV more efficient. and provide a better service, but at the same time also know what's going on and make the connections between someone who has a violation that their license might need to be suspended. So some of those issues need to be worked out. It will cost additional money to fix those.
Right.
But besides that, I mean, the chaos and unfortunately, some of that shortfall led to some folks being killed in New Hampshire because someone was driving that shouldn't be driving. So that's how some people say information technology. Those are important. I mean, we've done major investments also, not only related to the registry, but around. We have a new software system. DOR, the Department of Revenue, has a new software system in place now. The Department of Employment, if you will. Some people used to call it unemployment.
Right.
Was a couple of years back. There was also a new software update, a new software introduced that some folks, I'm sure, remember that there was also some issues around those who got laid off and needed to collect their unemployment were running into issues. Some of those, I believe, have been fixed by and large. By now, it was several years back. So that bill will be before, it's in my committee, we'll have a public hearing on that.
Put your teacher cap on and explain to the folks the difference, because some people might say, well, why isn't this done in the budget process? And there's a reason, I guess. There's bonding, which you chair, and there's the budget. What, for people, again, a little civics lesson here, what's the difference and why did these come up separately?
Well, for the state, there's two budgets, right? Mm-hmm. Has the operating budget, which is the one that everybody talks about.
The day-to-day, which is really the day-to-day grind.
Everybody's familiar with, everybody tries to influence, and that goes anything from paying the bills of the state, from operating all the various agencies, to some local aid in the form of education aid, for example, Chapter 70, and all that stuff is done on the operating budget. Anything else to do with major infrastructure, major investments that are considered capital investments for the state is done in what's called the capital budget, and that's usually through bonds. Once in a while, if in the past, if we have a huge surplus of revenue, we've applied some real what I call cash upfront to address some of those capital needs. But most of the time, all of those capital needs are done through bonds, by issuing bonds and getting the money from that in order to invest. And that's anything from South Coast Rail, for example, to new cars for the T, to blacktopping a particular road, or fixing a bridge, fixing a building, or building a new building. All of those are capital investments for the state, including IT, information technology, new computers, new software, updated all cybersecurity, for example. It's a big issue right now.
Yep.
Everywhere. And as we've learned,
cities and states are dealing with it.
In New Bedford,
yep,
we've had an issue with that. The city of New Bedford is not the only one. There have been other cities, but the state takes that very seriously as well. So that's a major IT investment, and usually that's done through bonding.
Is the scrutiny, or the, because I know that there's a lot of, obviously, representatives and a lot of projects that could be funded by the bonding process, and I would assume the scrutiny is kind of like the operating budget as well. You have to prioritize which ones are going to be done at a particular time.
Absolutely. There are priorities because there's so many needs.
Yep.
For example, we are very familiar with the dredging in New Bedford, of the harbor in New Bedford, yep, which will, that process has started. You're going to see the governor coming down and other administration officials making some announcements around dredging of the New Bedford harbor, which hasn't happened in over 50 years. Well, before that came about, we had a bond bill, right, that went through my committee. We actually earmarked, I personally, before the bill was reported out favorably from my committee, I earmarked $35 million specifically for the dredging of the New Bedford harbor. And we also did some for the Boston harbor. Mm-hmm. We did around $60 million for the Boston harbor. The Boston harbor is different. In addition to dredging, they do an actually deepening and widening the navigational channel, so it can take the bigger ships, the big container ships, what they call the post-Panama Canal ships, mm-hmm, the huge ships that Boston, in order to stay competitive with other ports, they need to do that. For us in New Bedford is dredging also of birthplaces, in other words, around the piers. Some of them are private, and the private interests will have to pitch in and put in part of the cost. Also, part of the navigational channels, in particular, inside of the hurricane barrier. All of that needs to be done in order to accommodate commerce, expand not only the fishing industry but all the other commercial enterprises going on, from offshore wind, for example, to other new developments that you have seen, such as I think we at some point at the Revere Copper site we're going to have a shipyard, right? Well, in order for that to happen, dredging is very important, even for that project, right? So this is a big deal. So,
and you put that in.
Yes.
You put that bill in, or I don't know if that's the proper term, but the language in. But that was done a while ago. What I'm getting at is it takes time. It's not as though when you do a bonding project, and I'm generalizing, it comes up before your committee now, you're debating it, whatever. That doesn't mean they get the money right there. I mean, you put in the bonding for the
that's an authorization,
dredging, right? You put in the bonding for the, and then it takes
the
due process.
I mean, you got to then, in this case, the city and the state we got to do the right studies to make sure what's really needed, what amount of investment needs to take place. And usually it's done by stages. It doesn't get all spent in one fiscal year in terms of the capital expenditure. It's usually done usually a project like that in New Bedford will take anything from 3 to 4 years. So hopefully the least amount, the better.
Right.
But also depends on the capability of the contractor and how fast they can move to get the job done.
And that's all. So, and really, that's all the projects you're dealing with. That's a time frame, if you will.
That's right.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, like in the Boston one, they already started as well, but it took several years. And in the case of Boston, they needed actually an authorization, money authorization from the federal government, from Congress itself. In our case, we don't need a direct appropriation from Congress, because in the budget of the Army Corps of Engineers budget also will be there some money there to help this whole project, because some of that is federal water, not federal waters, but are controlled by some of the channels are controlled by the Coast Guard.
Coast Guard, yeah, federal,
So,
yep. We were talking with State Representative Tony Cabral on this edition of the Beacon Hill Report, and one of the things we were talking about off camera, and you briefly mentioned it, but we wanted to talk about it, the education funding bill, which I know we talked about in February, I think, when we last time we spoke. Still a priority for the legislature. I know that, as we were saying, the wheels go slow, but are you still optimistic that there will be an education funding bill passed?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I think we are going to have so-called Chapter 70, to use the lingo, but it's really school money, school aid to all the communities, in this case for New Bedford and other communities. We are seriously engaged in that whole conversation and debate around reforming, particularly around 4 key areas of the formula, which is healthcare costs, special needs education, education with kids with economic disadvantaged kids, and English language students or kids. So you have those 4, and those are key for the reform, and those are key for the reform in particular for the city of New Bedford and other communities.
Gateway cities. Yeah.
Gateway cities.
Yep.
And so we are very engaged on that. I'm very optimistic we're going to get it done before the next school year.
Is there a holding? Is there a something that other folks are? I mean, because it seems you and your colleagues, when they've come on, are certainly very much in favor of it. But is there something holding it back from other representatives in other communities?
Well, you have 3 major pieces of legislation plus a 4th piece of legislation that deals or tries to tackle also the charter school funding mechanism.
Is the charter school going to be separate from this education reform bill, or is that part of it?
Well, I'm hoping that it's part of the whole discussion, right?
Okay.
Because it does impact public school funding, right? So you have two ways to approach it, which is presently the way it works is the so-called the reimbursement for the first 3 years that a student moves from the public school to a charter school. And there's also the idea that we should have a complete separate line item for the state to provide the aid for charter schools or the funding for charter schools.
So separate the charter and the public.
In essence, separated,
Correct.
but technically, but not completely.
Okay.
Right? The proposal would be, and that's a bill that I filed myself, and there's a bunch of other co-sponsors on that, and I've been working with the MMA and other organizations and school committee association, superintendents association, all those folks, and that would be to sort of provide that funding for charter schools as a two-component funding, right? Would be one which the school district would fund the statewide average amount of the formula that school has for public funding, and then the state would appropriate the remaining of the cost to make up the full foundation, amount, right? School foundation amount. Give you a quick example. This present year, not this present year, the present school year, the statewide average for Chapter 70, so for public funding for public schools,
Correct.
was $6,366. If I got the amount right, or maybe 633. But anyway, 6,000 plus, and then. But the foundation itself, the foundation formula for New Bedford, for example, is around between 11 and 13, depending on the components of those four components that I mentioned, right?
Yep.
Then the state would kick in and fund the rest of the amount. So let's say if the foundation formula funding for New Bedford, for example, let's say if it was 12,000, just for sake of discussion. 6,000 and some change would come out from the Chapter 70 that the city receives, and then the state would kick in the rest directly, which is not the case now. What the state does now is the state takes the whole, let's say the whole 12,000 would go to the charter school, and for the first 3 years, the state would reimburse the school district for that amount. The first year would be 100%, the second year would be 60% of that 12,000, and the third year would be 40%.
And that's the
of that
crux
12,000.
of the problem is they haven't been
That's right.
funding it.
And they haven't been funding that at 100%. So
Right.
When you have to do 100%, it's not really 100% reimbursement that the state should be doing. So we have to at least fix that reimbursement to be at 100%. That would be the minimum. Preferably, we would set up the formula or the funding mechanism in a way that it costs less to the community, it's predictable, we can project going forward.
Budget-wise for a
Budget-wise
municipality,
for a
correct.
municipality to plan, and there would be a small hit for the municipality versus what it is right now. So you have all those wheels turning in that sense. So you have all these possibilities. The hope is that we do the reform before the next school year, and it involves both the so-called the traditional Chapter 70 funding, which is the traditional school funding, public school funding, and at the same time we fix the charter school funding as well at the same time. Because if you don't do that, by providing more money for New Bedford or for Fall River or any other community, what you're doing is you're not really resolving the issue. Let's say instead of New Bedford getting 12,000 for discussion purposes,
Yeah.
don't hold me down to the 12 because it's not
Right,
exactly
right,
12.
right. It's
Instead of getting 12, they're going to get 16, for example. But we don't fix the charter school funding mechanism. All those 16 will go out with that
charter
kid
school.
back to the charter school. So we are almost back at the same situation.
And it does
so
seem-
we need to fix both at the same time.
It does seem too that it's the municipalities in the Commonwealth that are dealing with that charter school reimbursement issues too. So I don't know if when you're dealing with colleagues in the legislature, the ones that represent smaller communities that don't have charter schools, they're not dealing with the same issues that you and your
whatsoever.
colleagues are.
That's right.
It's not just, it's, as you said, Fall River, it's New Bedford, it's Springfield, Worcester, it's all
Right.
all the same.
26 communities.
Have charter schools?
no, 26 gateway cities.
Yep.
And the majority of all charter schools, by and large, not all, most of them are gateway cities, for the exception of Boston. Boston is not considered a gateway city.
Right.
But Boston has actually the largest number of charter schools, or the largest number of kids attending charter schools.
Well, the number you gave me from Boston was staggering.
Right, it's unbelievable. So it impacts them too, in a very serious way. So Boston has a lot at stake as well, and that's good. Some people might not, when you first look at it, says, well, gee, is Boston going to get everything? No, I think Boston is an important player and an important ally on this whole reform, especially trying to fix also the charter school funding formula, because it affects them even more than almost any other community. Yeah.
We were talking with State Representative Tony Cabral here on the Beacon Hill Report. One of the things I wanted to just touch upon briefly, you know that the Lieutenant Governor, I saw the article in the paper about the housing bill, and I know you've talked about housing being a huge issue, especially here in New Bedford, affordable housing. Obviously, I know there's disagreements, but do you expect at least a discussion taking place in the House about housing legislation coming up?
Yeah, I think we will get to some kind of understanding or agreement where we're going to go on this issue of housing. Housing is important. It's important for communities, not just for New Bedford, in particular for other communities like Boston, Boston and other surrounding communities around Boston and other major, or Worcester or Springfield. It's also important to us. But there's also another aspect of housing that is important for us. And that's a different bill that's been filed, not the governor's bill, that hopefully will have a ability to put some of that in place before the end of the 2-year legislative session.
Okay. Yep.
Hopefully next year, 2020, we'll have an economic development bill, and usually some of that will find itself in that bill because it is really around economic development, and housing is around economic development as well.
I mean, like I said, you talked about it, I think, in February briefly about that.
And there is a piece of legislation that's been filed around what's called neighborhood stabilization, which is going into communities, taking blighted houses and put them back on the market for several reasons. One, it creates affordable housing for those who might not be able to meet market rating housing, and let me step back. It creates a combination of both, right? Affordable and market rate. And I think for communities like New Bedford, that's important to have that combination, because market rating is also important. We want to bring in folks, working folks and middle class folks that also have some extra money available so they can also spend in the city that they live in.
And the reason it's interesting too is because commuter rail, as you touched upon briefly, which seems to be going forward, and it looks like it's going to happen here. You see housing prices in New Bedford in general going up.
Yes.
And with that commuter rail and with other things going on, I would imagine housing is going to get tighter down here.
Yeah, I think with commuter rail, with South Coast Rail, you're going to see probably some of that getting tighter. Some of those, if we don't have a recession, some of those prices will continue to get a little higher.
So this bill's a more preemptive strike too. Get this while it's...
Yes, right. So I think we need to make sure that they don't price people out, be from the rental market or from the ownership market. So I think it's an important issue. I think we need to resolve it, but also we got to have a component around blighted properties and look at neighborhoods. In which neighborhoods are priorities in terms of New Bedford and other communities.
Well, you see, I think the AG's office does some of that.
They're doing some of that already.
Yeah, and the matter of fact, I think there was a house that was just awarded to a family couple weeks ago, as a matter of fact, in New Bedford, and the transformation of that house, unbelievable, and the excitement of the family. We got it on camera. Right. It's priceless, really.
It is,
and I mean, and it's just one house at a time. I understand that,
but it's important because you can go into a neighborhood, a designated particular neighborhood that has a lot of those properties, and you can turn a neighborhood around, right? And because you can create opportunities for first-time home buyers. Doesn't have to be a single family. It can be a 2-family or a 3-family.
Oh, the before and after pictures are fantastic.
And especially if you look at neighborhoods that have a lot of 2 or 3 families, and you create the opportunities for first-time home buyers, be a young couple or otherwise, who buys it. One, it's at a price they can afford. Second, they then can rent the other apartments at a reasonable rent as well, because they don't need exorbitant amounts of rent in order to cover their mortgage.
Correct.
And then when you have owner-occupied properties in any neighborhood, it really changes the neighborhood. So I think that's important, and we're working very hard on that.
And this, I mean, New Bedford is just known, growing up, just with its tenements and the families and the closeness. Yep. I mean, that's maybe it's not the same anymore, but you hear about those stories about people growing up in neighborhoods with tenements.
You knew everybody in the house.
Exactly.
You had friendships.
Families lived in the tent. Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know, that's they can be really a great opportunity for a lot of families. You know?
We've got about a minute and a half left, but I wanted to touch quickly on something that I know is near and dear to you, but I know it's only in the Senate right now, but I'm just kind of looking for your overall reaction. But the Ernestina, I know
Yes.
changing the Ernestina from, I guess, lack of a better word, ownership or responsibility from DCR going to the Mass Maritime. Is that something, a good move for the Ernestina?
I think it is.
Okay.
And we've been working on that now for quite some time for two things, myself and Senator Montigny, because we've been for many years, as you know, Jim, this has been sort of one of our issues that we kept supporting and making sure that the Ernestina had the support that needed. What's happening now is we have really the Ernestina being rehabbed, really transformed. The next time
It looks fantastic,
when you see it sailing into New Bedford, you're going to be amazed.
Yep.
And that's been an investment both by the state and private investment. And we needed to have the Ernestina in a place that really knows about ships, right? Knows about boats. And Mass Maritime knows that.
Oh,
right?
absolutely, yep.
That's part of their business.
Great reputation the school does.
And also creates an opportunity for the cadets, the young men and young women who go there, to have an experience and to get trained not only on the regular ship that they have, but also on a so-called tall ship. That's a great experience, and it's a great way of keeping the Ernestina working in a sense.
So would it be?
Because wood boats need to be sailing; they need to be in the water, or else
That's
they
a great,
fall apart.
and
right?
the people who go on it, I can't believe it.
Yeah, but the key thing for us and for Senator Montigny, it's been for both of us, has been that we support that as long as the home port remains New Bedford. And it
okay,
will
that's
remain.
what I was going to say. Would it stay in New Bedford or go to the Mass Maritime?
It's specific on the legislation. The legislation will be coming to the House to be passed by the House as well. That it spends time actually in New Bedford. We are looking possibly around at least 90 days in New Bedford. That will have programs for our kids in New Bedford. We'll be here for during the Cape Verde Recognition Week, and have
That would make sense.
and have opportunities as well to
Yeah.
go to other communities, be Wareham or Boston, that also has large Cape Verdean American communities, and to other communities. I mean, the ship, the schooner is really admired and loved in many places, you know. And hopefully we get this done, both the legislation and the final refitting and retooling of the schooner before by May of next year, so it can lead the parade of the Mayflower returning
Oh, that'd
to
be
Plymouth.
great. Yeah.
And then from there we'll come to New Bedford and stay for the Cape Verde Recognition Week and so forth.
That's good stuff.
So I think it's a great move. It will be there. I think it's the right place to be. I think they know in order to maintain it, because, you know, wood chips need to be maintained every year.
Yeah, and that's the difficult thing.
Key.
Yep.
And that's key. Yeah.
The half hour's gone by very quickly.
Yes.
It's always good seeing you. I appreciate your time.
I
know you're busy.
I had a bunch of other things to talk to you about. Maybe we got to make these more often than twice a year, right? And so we can. There are so many important issues that I think we could talk about, but maybe it will be the next show.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Jim, thank you very much, and this is wonderful. Great opportunity to really communicate with my constituents in New Bedford and the residents of New Bedford about what's going on and how important, at least all of us believe and feel about fighting for this city.
Our guest has been State Representative Tony Cabral. I thank him. You've been watching the Beacon Real Report here on the New Bedford Cable Network.